At 8:36 a.m. on November 14, 1943, the USS William D. Porter, a Fletcher-class destroyer with crew of 327 men, fired a live Mark 15 torpedo directly at the USS Iowa, a battleship carrying President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill's representative, and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Tehran Conference, where they would meet with Joseph Stalin to plan the final phases of World War II. The torpedo, traveling at 46 knots with a 600-pound TNT warhead, was heading directly toward the Iowa's starboard side, where the president was standing on deck watching anti-aircraft drills. Impact would occur in approximately 90 seconds, killing the President of the United States and potentially altering the entire outcome of World War II. This was not an enemy attack. This was an accident. The USS William D. Porter, nicknamed Willie D by her crew, had accidentally fired the torpedo during what was supposed to be a training exercise with dummy torpedoes, except someone had forgotten to remove the primer from one torpedo tube, converting what should have been a harmless drill into a potential assassination of the president by his own Navy. Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Walter, the William D. Porter's commanding officer, stood on the bridge watching the torpedo wake streak toward the Iowa, experiencing what would later be described as the worst moment any naval officer had experienced that didn't involve actual combat. He had approximately 60 seconds to decide how to warn the Iowa that a torpedo was heading toward them, knowing that breaking radio silence would reveal the top-secret convoy's position to any German U-boats monitoring communications, but not warning them would result in the torpedo hitting the battleship carrying the president. Walter grabbed the radio handset and transmitted in the clear, no encryption, broadcasting to anyone listening. "Lion, lion, lion, this is Spearfish. Torpedo in the water, torpedo heading your way. Take evasive action." The Iowa's captain, Captain John McCrea, received the warning with approximately 50 seconds before impact. The battleship, 887 feet long and displacing 45,000 tons, was not designed for rapid maneuvering, but McCrea ordered emergency full speed ahead and hard turn to port, the Iowa's massive screws churning water, as the ship began a turn that would take precious seconds to complete. President Roosevelt, informed that a torpedo was heading toward his ship, was wheeled to the starboard rail, where he insisted on watching the torpedo approach rather than taking cover below decks. His Secret Service detail was reportedly horrified, but Roosevelt said, "I want to see this torpedo that's trying to kill me." The torpedo passed approximately 100 feet astern of the Iowa at 8:37:52 a.m., close enough that Roosevelt and his staff could see the torpedo wake, close enough that impact would have occurred if the Iowa hadn't turned, close enough that the detonation when the torpedo reached the end of its run and exploded harmlessly created a water column visible from the Iowa's deck. President Roosevelt, watching the explosion, reportedly said, "Well, that was exciting. I hope our boys are better shots when they're aiming at the enemy." This incident, accidentally firing a torpedo at the President of the United States, was not the USS William D. Porter's first catastrophic mistake. It wouldn't be their last. Over the next 18 months, the William D. Porter would establish a reputation as the unluckiest, most accident-prone, most cursed ship in the United States Navy, a ship that survived the war despite appearing to actively try to sink itself through sheer incompetence and improbable bad luck. If you want to see how one destroyer almost killed FDR, survived being the most hated ship in the Navy, and eventually sank with 0 casualties because even kamikaze couldn't kill this crew properly, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of military service that was simultaneously terrifying and ridiculous. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the darkly comic tragedy of the USS William D. Porter, the ship that proved you don't have to be competent to be memorable. Back to July 1943 and the commissioning of a ship that would spend 2 years embarrassing the entire Navy. The USS William D. Porter, hull number DD-579, was a Fletcher-class destroyer commissioned on July 6, 1943, at Orange, Texas. She was named after Commodore William D. Porter, a Civil War naval officer, and was one of 175 Fletcher-class destroyers built during World War II. The Fletcher class was considered excellent, fast, well-armed, reliable, and effective. The USS William D. Porter would prove that even excellent ships could become disasters when crewed by the Navy's most unfortunate sailors. The ship's specifications were standard: 376 feet long, 2,500 tons displacement, capable of 38 knots maximum speed, armed with 5 5-inch guns, 10 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 7 20mm guns, and 10 21-inch torpedo tubes arranged in 2 quintuple mounts. The crew consisted of 327 officers and enlisted men, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Walter, a competent officer who would spend the next 18 months dealing with catastrophes that weren't his fault, but were definitely his responsibility. The William D. Porter's problems began during shakedown cruise in October 1943. Shakedown cruise is when a new ship tests its systems, trains its crew, and works out any mechanical issues before deploying to combat zones. The William D. Porter's shakedown revealed that, while the ship mechanically functioned fine, the crew had remarkable talent for creating disasters through a combination of bad luck and questionable judgment. During gunnery exercises, one of the 5-inch guns misfired, the shell exploding in the barrel rather than launching. This was technically a mechanical failure, faulty ammunition, but it set the tone for the ship's reputation. During subsequent exercises, the ship experienced electrical failures, a small fire in the galley, and an incident where a sailor fell overboard during rough seas and had to be rescued. None of these incidents were particularly unusual for new ships. All ships experienced mechanical issues and accidents during shakedown, but the William D. Porter would experience them with unusual frequency. The ship completed shakedown and was assigned to convoy escort duty, a standard assignment for destroyers. In early November 1943, the William D. Porter received orders for a special assignment: escort the USS Iowa from Norfolk, Virginia, to North Africa, as part of a top-secret convoy carrying President Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference. This was considered a prestigious assignment. Escorting the president was honor reserved for trusted, reliable ships. The fact that William D. Porter received this assignment suggests that their shakedown problems hadn't yet established them as notably problematic. That was about to change. The convoy departed Norfolk on November 12, 1943. The convoy consisted of the battleship USS Iowa, carrying President Roosevelt, several other destroyers, and support vessels. Security was extreme. The president's presence was classified top secret. Radio silence was mandatory, and the convoy route was planned to avoid known U-boat patrol areas. The convoy was scheduled to arrive in North Africa, where Roosevelt would transfer to aircraft for the flight to Tehran. The first incident occurred during departure from Norfolk. The William D. Porter was maneuvering to take position in the convoy formation when her anchor, which should have been secured, broke loose from its stowage. The anchor dragged across the deck, swung outward on its chain, and struck the railing of the USS Iowa, breaking off approximately 10 feet of the battleship's safety railing. The Iowa's captain was reportedly furious, signaling the William D. Porter, "Secure your equipment properly or return to port." The William D. Porter's crew hastily secured the anchor and continued with the convoy, but the incident established their reputation with the other ships. The Porter was crewed by incompetence. The second incident occurred on November 13, 1943, during the convoy's first night at sea. The convoy was maintaining strict blackout conditions, no lights visible that might be spotted by German U-boats. One of the William D. Porter's sailors, performing maintenance in a restricted area, accidentally triggered the release mechanism on one of the ship's depth charges. The depth charge, a 600-pound canister of high explosives designed to sink to preset depth before detonating to destroy submarines, rolled off the stern and into the ocean. Depth charges are armed by water pressure as they sink. The charge that fell from the William D. Porter was set to detonate at 50 feet depth. It sank, reached 50 feet, and exploded approximately 3,000 yards behind the convoy, creating a massive underwater explosion and surface water column visible for miles. The explosion occurred at night, when sound and light carried for extraordinary distances, potentially revealing the convoy's position to any German U-boats in the area. The Iowa immediately signaled, "What was that explosion? Are we under attack?" The William D. Porter had to admit they'd accidentally dropped a depth charge. The Iowa's response was not recorded in official logs, but was reported by William D. Porter crew members as extremely profane. The other escort destroyers began referring to the William D. Porter as the ship that's going to get us all killed. President Roosevelt, informed of the incident, reportedly found it amusing rather than concerning, commenting, "At least our boys are keeping the Germans on their toes, even if accidentally." Then came November 14th, 1943, and the incident that would make the USS William D. Porter infamous throughout the Navy. The convoy was conducting anti-aircraft drills, standard practice to keep crews alert and train for potential German air attacks. The drills involved ships firing their anti-aircraft guns at towed targets while maintaining formation. The William D. Porter was also conducting torpedo drill, practicing the procedures for firing torpedoes at enemy ships. Torpedo drills on American destroyers typically use dummy torpedoes with the warhead and primer removed, making them incapable of actually launching. The drill involved going through all the procedures for targeting and firing without actually shooting live weapons. This allowed crews to practice without wasting expensive torpedoes or risking hitting friendly ships. At 8:30 a.m., the William D. Porter's torpedo crew was conducting drill on the starboard torpedo mount, a quintuple tube arrangement capable of firing 5 torpedoes. The torpedo mount consisted of 5 21-inch diameter tubes arranged in a rotating mount, each tube capable of launching a Mark 15 torpedo weighing 3,000 pounds with a 600-pound TNT warhead. The tubes were numbered 1 through 5 from port to starboard. During drill, the procedure was to load dummy torpedoes with the warhead removed and the primer mechanism disabled, making them incapable of actually firing, even if the firing lever was pulled. The torpedo crew consisted of torpedo man, second class Lawton Dawson, who operated the firing controls, torpedo man, third class Edwin Miller, who loaded the torpedoes and set the running depth, and torpedo man, first class Lawrence Murphy, who supervised the operation and ensured proper procedures were followed. The crew had practiced this drill dozens of times during training. The procedure was routine: target the practice enemy ship using optical sights, calculate firing solution based on target course and speed, simulate loading torpedoes, call out the commands, and pull the firing lever to hear the click of the firing mechanism engaging with an empty tube. At 8:34 a.m., Murphy called out, "Simulated target, battleship bearing 095, range 6,000 yards, load tubes 1 through 5 with dummy fish, set running depth 15 feet, prepare to fire on command." Muller confirmed tubes 1 through 5 were loaded with practice torpedoes, except he didn't actually verify tube 3 because he assumed it had been prepared with the others. This assumption was Murphy's first procedural error. At 8:35 a.m., the crew practiced aiming procedures. They rotated the torpedo mount to face the Iowa, used the optical sight to track the battleship, and calculated the lead angle needed to hit a moving target. The calculations were correct. The Iowa was steaming at 18 knots on a steady course, and the firing solution would place the torpedo on an intercept course with the battleship's starboard side, where the president was standing watching anti-aircraft drills. In a real combat situation, this would be a perfect setup. In a drill with dummy torpedoes, it was harmless practice. At 8:36 a.m., Murphy gave the command, "Fire tube 3." Dawson, sitting at the firing control panel, reached for the firing lever for tube 3. He pulled the lever, expecting to hear the distinctive click of the firing mechanism engaging with nothing, the sound that confirmed the drill was working properly. Instead, he heard something completely different, a hiss of compressed air as the tube's air flask released 500 pounds per square inch of pressure, forcing the torpedo out of the tube. The hiss was followed by the clang of the tube's breech opening, the rear door of the tube swinging open after the torpedo launched, and then the splash as a 3,000-pound Mark 15 torpedo hit the water 30 feet from the ship's side. The torpedo's propeller began spinning immediately, the torpedo accelerating to 46 knots, heading directly toward the Iowa, 6,000 yards distant on the bearing where the crew had been aiming during their practice drill. Dawson stared at the torpedo wake in disbelief. He looked at Murphy. Murphy looked at Muller. All three men realized simultaneously what had happened. Tube 3 had been loaded with a live torpedo instead of a dummy, the primer had not been removed, and the impact pistol, the mechanism that detonates the warhead when the torpedo hits a target, was armed and functional. They had just fired a live torpedo at the ship carrying the President of the United States. Murphy grabbed the nearest phone and called the bridge. The phone rang twice before being answered by the bridge talker, Seaman First Class Robert Jones. Murphy shouted into the phone, "Bridge, this is Torpedo Mount. We have an emergency. We just fired a live torpedo at the Iowa. This is not a drill. Live torpedo in the water heading toward Iowa. I repeat, live torpedo heading toward Iowa." Jones, thinking this was a prank or a misunderstanding, replied, "Say again? Did you say live torpedo?" Murphy screamed, "Yes, live torpedo. Get the captain. Warn the Iowa. We fired a real fish." Jones, realizing Murphy was serious, yelled across the bridge, "Captain! Torpedo Mount says they fired a live torpedo at Iowa." Lieutenant Commander Walter, who had been watching the anti-aircraft drill, spun around and grabbed the phone from Jones. "Torpedo Mount, bridge, confirm your last transmission." Murphy, his voice shaking, replied, "Captain, Tube 3 had a live fish. Dawson pulled the firing lever during drill, and the torpedo launched. It's heading directly for Iowa, 6,000 yards range. Torpedo speed 46 knots. Time to impact approximately 90 seconds. Walter looked at his watch. 8:36:48 a.m. He calculated 90 seconds meant impact at approximately 8:38:20 a.m. He had less than 2 minutes to decide how to warn the Iowa. Walter's options were limited. Standard protocol required maintaining radio silence during convoy operations to prevent German U-boats from detecting the convoy's position and course. Breaking radio silence would potentially expose the convoy to submarine attack. But not breaking radio silence would mean the torpedo would hit the Iowa without warning, killing the President of the United States and everyone near the impact point. The choice was between possibly endangering the convoy and certainly killing the President. Walter grabbed the radio handset and transmitted in the clear, no encryption, broadcasting on the emergency frequency that all ships monitored. "Lion, lion, lion, this is Spearfish. Torpedo in the water. Torpedo heading your way. Take evasive action. Torpedo bearing 275 relative. Distance 6,000 yards, closing fast." Lion was the Iowa's radio call sign. Spearfish was the William D. Porter's call sign. The transmission was heard by every ship in the convoy, by any German U-boats monitoring the frequency, and by the Iowa's radio room, where it was immediately relayed to Captain John McCrea on the bridge. McCrea received the warning at 8:37:04 a.m., approximately 76 seconds after the torpedo had been fired. He looked at his navigation plot, calculated the bearing Walter had transmitted, and realized a torpedo was approaching from the William D. Porter's position. His immediate thought was that the Porter was under attack by a submarine, and the torpedo had missed the Porter and was heading toward the Iowa. He ordered, "Emergency full ahead, right full rudder, sound general quarters, incoming torpedo." The Iowa's engine room responded immediately. The battleship's 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding steam to 4 General Electric turbines, producing 212,000 shaft horsepower, driving the Iowa's 4 propellers at maximum speed. The ship began accelerating from 18 knots toward her maximum speed of 33 knots. But acceleration took time. The Iowa weighed 45,000 tons and couldn't instantly reach maximum speed. The turn also took time. The Iowa's rudder could turn the ship, but turning an 87-foot-long battleship required distance and seconds that might not be available. President Roosevelt, who had been watching anti-aircraft drills from a deck chair on the starboard side, was informed by his Secret Service detail that a torpedo was heading toward the ship, and he needed to take cover below decks immediately. Roosevelt refused. He ordered his wheelchair moved to the starboard rail, where he could see the approaching torpedo, telling his Secret Service agents, "I want to see this torpedo that's trying to kill me. If it hits, I'll be dead whether I'm up here or below decks. I prefer to watch." At 8:37:52 a.m., the torpedo passed approximately 100 feet astern of the Iowa, close enough that the Iowa's crew on the fantail could see the torpedo wake, close enough that the torpedo's propeller noise was audible above the ship's engines, close enough that impact would have occurred if the Iowa hadn't turned. The torpedo continued past the Iowa, running on its preset course until, Its fuel was exhausted at approximately 8:39 a.m. When the torpedo's propulsion system shut down, the impact pistol armed itself, a safety feature designed to prevent the torpedo from exploding if it missed its target and circled back toward the launching ship. After arming, the torpedo exploded when its automatic scuttling charge detonated to prevent the torpedo from being recovered by the enemy. The explosion created a water column approximately 200 feet high, visible from both the Iowa and the William D. Porter. President Roosevelt, watching from the Iowa's starboard rail, reportedly said, "Well, that was exciting. I hope our boys are better shots when they're aiming at the enemy." His Secret Service detail was less sanguine, immediately increasing security protocols and demanding explanations for how a U.S. Navy ship had fired a torpedo at the president. The Iowa signaled the William D. Porter, "You are ordered to return to port immediately. Prepare to be boarded by security." Detail: the William D. Porter turned around and headed back toward Norfolk, escorted by another destroyer to ensure they didn't cause any additional catastrophes. The rest of the convoy continued toward North Africa with President Roosevelt, who reportedly spent the remainder of the voyage asking if that destroyer with the exciting torpedo had been properly punished. The William D. Porter arrived at Norfolk on November 16, 1943, and was immediately placed under armed guard. The entire crew was arrested, all 327 men confined to the ship, while Navy investigators determined what had happened and whether it was accident, sabotage, or assassination attempt. The investigation lasted 3 days. During the investigation, several facts emerged. First, the primer had not been removed from torpedo tube 3 during preparation for drill. This was a failure of procedure by the torpedo crew, specifically the responsibility of the torpedo maintenance team that prepared the tubes for drill. Second, the firing mechanism had not been safetied, another procedural failure. Third, the torpedo had been armed and running, meaning the impact pistol that detonates the warhead on contact had been activated. This should not have been the case for a drill torpedo. The investigation concluded that the incident was accident caused by multiple procedural failures rather than deliberate sabotage or assassination attempt. This was good news in that no one would be executed for trying to kill the president. This was bad news in that it meant the crew was simply incompetent, which was almost as embarrassing. Torpedo Man Second Class Lawton Dawson was court-martialed for firing the torpedo, the only known case of a U.S. Navy sailor being court-martialed for actions taken against a U.S. president. He was found guilty of negligence and sentenced to 14 years hard labor at the naval prison at Portsmouth. However, President Roosevelt, who apparently found the entire incident more amusing than threatening, intervened and pardoned Dawson, reducing his sentence to time served, 3 days of investigation confinement. Roosevelt's reasoning: it was an accident. The boy was following procedures. The procedures were wrong, but he was doing his job. Lieutenant Commander Walter was reprimanded but not court-martialed. The Navy recognized that while the incident occurred under his command, the specific failures were at lower levels, and Walter had responded appropriately once the torpedo was in the water. He remained in command of the William D. Porter, which would prove to be its own punishment. The USS William D. Porter returned to service in December 1943 with a reputation as the ship that tried to kill FDR. No captain wanted the Porter in their task force. No admiral wanted them in their fleet. Other ships' crews mockingly saluted the Porter when passing, calling out, "Don't shoot! We're on your side!" The Porter's crew endured the mockery while trying to redeem their ship's reputation through competent service. Redemption proved difficult because the accidents continued. In January 1944, while operating in the Aleutian Islands, the William D. Porter ran aground in Dutch Harbor during heavy fog. The grounding caused minor damage to the keel and required the ship to be dry-docked for repairs. The grounding was technically not the crew's fault. The fog was exceptionally thick and navigation was difficult, but given the Porter's reputation, the incident was attributed to incompetence rather than bad weather. In February 1944, the William D. Porter's boilers experienced repeated failures requiring the ship to be towed into port for repairs on 3 separate occasions. Boiler failures are mechanical issues that can occur on any ship, but on the William D. Porter, they reinforced the impression that the ship was cursed. Sailors on other ships began calling the Porter the ship that can't do anything right. In March 1944, during gunnery practice, one of the Porter's 5-inch guns exploded when a shell detonated prematurely in the barrel, destroying the gun and injuring 3 crew members. This was the second gun to explode on the Porter. The first had occurred during shakedown cruise. While gun explosions were not unheard of with faulty ammunition, having 2 explosions on the same ship in less than a year was extraordinarily unlucky. In April 1944, the William D. Porter was assigned to escort duty in the North Pacific. During a storm, one of the ship's depth charge racks broke loose and slid across the deck, crushing a sailor's leg and nearly going overboard before being secured. The injured sailor survived but lost his leg, adding to the Porter's casualty list, despite never having engaged enemy forces. Despite these incidents, the William D. Porter did successfully complete missions. The ship escorted convoys, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and performed shore bombardment in support of Aleutian operations. The crew was not actually incompetent. They performed their duties adequately when disasters weren't occurring. But the disasters occurred with sufficient frequency that the ship's reputation as jinxed was reinforced rather than overcome. In June 1944, the William D. Porter was transferred to the Pacific Theater for operations against Japanese forces. The crew hoped that combat operations would allow them to prove their competence and overcome their reputation. This hope was partially fulfilled. The Porter participated in several successful operations, but the curse continued. During the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, the William D. Porter fired torpedoes at Japanese ships with no confirmed hits. This was not unusual. Torpedo accuracy was poor throughout the war, but on the Porter, it was interpreted as further evidence of incompetence. During shore bombardment of Leyte, one of the Porter's guns jammed, requiring the ship to withdraw for repairs, while other ships continued the bombardment. In December 1944, the William D. Porter participated in the liberation of the Philippines, providing escort and fire support. During these operations, the ship functioned adequately without major incidents, suggesting that perhaps the curse was lifting. The crew began to believe that their string of bad luck might be ending. Then came June 10, 1945, and the incident that would end the USS William D. Porter's service in a manner entirely consistent with the ship's history of improbable disasters. The Porter was on picket duty off Okinawa, part of the defensive screen protecting the invasion fleet from Japanese air attacks. The ship had been on station for 3 days without incident, conducting radar patrols and anti-aircraft operations. At 8:15 a.m., radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft. The Porter went to general quarters, crew manning battle stations, anti-aircraft guns tracking the approaching planes. The Japanese aircraft turned out to be a single A-6M-0 fighter conducting a kamikaze attack, a suicide mission where the pilot would crash his plane into an American ship. The Zero dove toward the William D. Porter from 8,000 feet altitude, approaching at approximately 300 miles per hour. The Porter's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, shooting at the diving aircraft with 40mm and 20mm guns. The gunfire was accurate. Tracers converged on the Zero, multiple hits visible as shells struck the aircraft. The Zero began smoking, clearly damaged, its trajectory becoming erratic. At 8:17 a.m., the Zero crashed into the ocean approximately 100 feet from the William D. Porter's starboard side. The crew cheered, believing they'd successfully shot down the kamikaze before it could hit them. They'd done their job, defended their ship, survived another day. Victory. Except the Zero was carrying a bomb. When the aircraft hit the water, the bomb detonated in an underwater explosion directly beneath the William D. Porter's hull. The explosion, estimated at 500 to 1,000 pounds of explosives, created a massive underwater pressure wave that struck the ship's hull, rupturing plates, breaking the keel, and flooding multiple compartments. The William D. Porter immediately began taking on water, listing to starboard, clearly sinking. Lieutenant Commander Walter, who had somehow remained in command despite the torpedo incident and all subsequent disasters, ordered abandon ship at 8:19 a.m. The crew evacuated in an orderly manner, using life rafts and jumping into the ocean where nearby ships could rescue them. The evacuation took approximately 12 minutes. At 8:31 a.m., the USS William D. Porter rolled over and sank in 2,400 feet of water, approximately 65 miles off Okinawa. The remarkable part, 0 casualties. Every single crew member survived. The ship that had spent 2 years experiencing improbable disasters, that had nearly killed the president, that had dropped depth charges on itself, that had exploded guns and run aground and broken down repeatedly, that had been the most cursed ship in the Navy. That ship sank without killing a single member of its crew. The kamikaze that sank the William D. Porter achieved the dubious distinction of being the only kamikaze attack that sank a ship while killing none of its crew. The crew was rescued by nearby destroyers, transferred to other ships, and eventually sent back to the United States. The official Navy report on the sinking noted, USS William D. Porter sunk by enemy action with 0 casualties, in keeping with the vessel's history of surviving improbable circumstances. An unofficial note in the margin, attributed to an unknown Navy clerk, read, "Even the kamikaze couldn't kill this crew properly. The curse extends to their enemies." The William D. Porter's crew received new assignments on other ships. Many reported that their new shipmates, upon learning they had served on the Porter, would back away slowly and refuse to work near them, convinced the curse would transfer. Some crew members claimed the curse did transfer. They reported unusual numbers of minor accidents and equipment failures on their new ships, though nothing approaching the Porter's catastrophic frequency. Lieutenant Commander Walter received a new command, the destroyer USS Young, which he commanded without incident through the end of the war. He later stated in interviews, "The William D. Porter was a fine ship with a good crew who experienced extraordinarily bad luck. We did our jobs to the best of our abilities. Sometimes your best isn't good enough to overcome circumstance, but you do it anyway. I'm proud of my crew. We never quit despite being the laughingstock of the Navy." Lawton Dawson, the torpedo man who had fired the torpedo at President Roosevelt, remained in the Navy and retired in 1962 as a chief petty officer with an honorable service record. He rarely discussed the torpedo incident, but when pressed would say, "I pulled the lever I was told to pull. The torpedo fired because procedures weren't followed by people upstream of me, but I pulled the lever, so it's my responsibility." President Roosevelt understood that. He pardoned me because he understood the difference between accident and malice. The USS William D. Porter was never replaced. The hull number, DD 579, was not reassigned to another ship, unusual in a Navy that typically recycled hull numbers. The Navy apparently decided that the number was cursed and should be retired. The ship's bell and several other artifacts were salvaged and are displayed at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, labeled USS William D. Porter, the unluckiest ship in naval history. The story of the William D. Porter became Navy legend, told in training courses as an example of what happens when procedures aren't followed, and as a cautionary tale about the importance of attention to detail. The story was also told in bars where sailors gathered, usually with increasing embellishment about the number and severity of the Porters. Disasters. Some versions claim the ship experienced dozens of catastrophes. Official records document approximately 15 significant incidents, which is still remarkably high for a ship that served less than 2 years. Post-war analysis of the Porter's accidents revealed that most were caused by a combination of mechanical failures, procedural errors, and bad luck rather than incompetence. The torpedo incident resulted from 3 separate procedural failures occurring simultaneously. Improbable, but not impossible. The depth charge incident resulted from a faulty release mechanism combined with a sailor being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gun explosions resulted from faulty ammunition, a widespread problem affecting multiple ships. The grounding resulted from fog, the boiler failures from defective equipment. But coincidence of this magnitude seemed beyond probability. 15 significant incidents on one ship in less than 2 years suggested something beyond normal. Operational risk, whether curse, statistical anomaly, or the Navy assigning problem sailors to the ship that already had a bad reputation, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The USS William D. Porter definitely experienced extraordinary bad luck. The legacy is complicated. The William D. Porter is remembered for comedy, the absurdity of a ship that fired a torpedo at the president, the improbability of a kamikaze sinking a ship with 0 casualties, the accumulation of disasters that seemed beyond belief. But it's also tragedy. These were real sailors trying to do their jobs under difficult circumstances, dealing with equipment failures and bad luck, while being mocked by their peers, serving their country while being treated as jokes. The crew of the William D. Porter served honorably under conditions that would have broken less determined sailors. They endured mockery, maintained their ship despite mechanical problems, and continued performing missions despite their reputation. They survived disasters that should have killed them, maintained morale despite being cursed, and ultimately completed their service without dishonor. November 14, 1943 was when they fired the torpedo at FDR. 8:36 a.m. was the launch. 90 seconds until impact. 100 feet was the missed distance. November 16th was the arrest. 3 days of investigation, 1 court-martial, presidential pardon, 2 years of service, 15 major incidents, 0 combat deaths. June 10th, 1945 was the sinking. 0 casualties from the sinking. 327 crew members survived everything. 1 ship, 327 cursed sailors. 1 torpedo fired at the president. 1 depth charge dropped on themselves. 2 guns exploded. 1 grounding. 3 boiler failures. 1 kamikaze, 0 deaths, survived by being too unlucky to kill properly, proved that survival sometimes requires enduring mockery with grace, and that the worst curse is being remembered for your failures rather than your service. Not because they were incompetent, because bad luck makes better stories than competence, and sometimes serving with honor means enduring ridicule for circumstances beyond your control. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of service that was simultaneously tragic and absurd. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who served despite mockery, who endured disaster with determination, and who proved that survival matters more than reputation. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.